Hey, well, good morning. First, I feel like I owe you an update, not on just work and stuff like that, what I'm doing, but we're okay. Um, the weather wasn't too bad here. We were projected to get anywhere from, I think, early accounts, we were talking hurricane conditions, but as time went on, the hurricane moved north and we didn't really get anything near that. We had a solid plan going into it. This is something that we've worked on for over a year. We had a good plan. Knew we were going to execute that if we needed to stay safe. Didn't need to. So, fortunately, we ended up getting some winds anywhere from sustained 20, 30 gusts up to 50, I suppose, and got a lot of rain last night, and it came hard, and it all came at once for 3-4 hours, and the atmospheric pressure changed a little bit. My eyes were kind of swollen shut this morning, so I don't know what happened, but just kind of some of those things that change, but. Rest assured, we were safe. There was no reason to be concerned for us. There are far more people that are going to be impacted by the storms that are moving north towards the United States and Florida. So certainly be praying for those folks because, it's a pretty big deal. So as we prep, and you've already heard the scripture readings for this morning, certainly one of my favorite texts to preach on is Jesus is talking about building the rock, building upon the rock. And so I certainly want to unpack that, and I want to talk about how God created things. So let's start there. If you come down here, a couple of the beaches have these huge rocks on the shore, and the beaches are Girl Scout and glass, and they have these huge rocks on them. And you just look at them and you're in awe of how they would ever even got there. And you wonder, what would it have taken to get there? What would it have taken to put that large of rock right where it is? As you well know, the big buzz is about the hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey cleanup and Hurricane Irma coming into Florida, and how it's impacted the Caribbeans and Barbuda and Antigua and the Antilles Islands, and certainly Cuba, and you were wondering about how we were doing. But Hurricane Harvey hit a few weeks ago, as you well know, and when it came into Texas, it came through an area called Port Aransas, and came in through as a Category 4 before it slowed down. But once it hit the mainland, it slowed down quite a bit. And the area that it came into, Port Aransas, was a place where Steph and I had stayed in a hotel in October 2009 when we had gone down to a wedding. And this hotel is called the Lighthouse, and it's beautiful, and it looks out into the bay, which is, the bay, the Gulf. It's kind of a peninsula of a very, very small part of Texas, obviously out in the Gulf. But, that hurricane came through as a Category 4 and hit into those areas where it's right up next to the water. And so as I was thinking about the rock that Christ was going to build his church on, and thinking about how rocks come along the shores, and thinking about how this beautiful hotel that we had stayed in got hit by a Category 4 hurricane, it must have had a solid foundation for it to stay up. So this morning we're going to talk about the rock, a rock, and some rocks. Isaiah's reading gives the nation of Israel some comfort when they're in disarray. By the time they understand Isaiah's writing, they've been in exile in Babylon for a while. So as we take a look at that, understand the conditions in which the audience is hearing the text from Isaiah, and things aren't really good. Isaiah's words start off by addressing those who pursue righteousness, those who are seeking God's refuge. And it says, "Look to the rock from which you were hewn, quarry from which you were dug." Look to. And imagine this. This is an audience who is exiled and in crisis as they understand it. And Isaiah tells them to look to the rock in which they were given form and shape. That word hewn describes the process of being struck by a hard object to give a desirable shape and form to the rock itself. Look to the rock from which you were given shape, and then look to the quarry from which you were dug. Look into the pit in which you were dug out of. So the image is like this hole that they would find the rock and rescue it out of. So he says, look to the quarry or the pit in which you were dug out of. God is speaking to a broken nation to remind them of where they came from. And I personally think a rock that Isaiah is referencing is Mount Sinai, where Moses was given the law. And the pit from which the rock was dug out of was Egypt during the Exodus. Isaiah tells the audience to remember where they came from, remember what God has already done in their life, and trace their lineage back to the call of faith. He mentions Sarah and Abraham, who it was already impossible for them to have a child when God called them. Circumstances are bleak, they're miserable, and there's no way they're having kids without God intervening here. Even though their faith was forged by something as solid as God's promise. Now, I shared with you guys a few weeks ago about Jesus walking on water and how the disciples became afraid. And when Peter was saying, "Tell me to go walk on water and I will," and then he goes out, and when the winds came up, he got scared and he began to drown and asked for Jesus to rescue him. And Jesus tells him that he has little faith. I shared how in the midst of the storm, when the wind picks up, we need to keep our focus on Jesus. Now imagine the nation that Isaiah is addressing is a people who walked through a sea that was split in two so they could escape Egypt. They were a people who had been through much and still seen God work. And yet they're exiled because they refused to hear the warnings of God. And Isaiah's words start with those who pursue righteousness. You who pursue righteousness, look to the rock from which you were hewn. Look to the rock from which you were given form. Look to the pit in which you were dug out of. Look back to your great-grandparents and see how God provided for them in the midst of their struggles. And after looking upon that God who gives a promise, for the Lord comforts Zion, his people, and he fixes all the destruction, devastation, and desolation in their life. As they look upon God and remember how faithful he has already been. Then he tells the audience to listen again as he will set his justice for a light to the peoples. Justice and righteousness are terms God uses for the Israelites' reality. He told them exile was judgment for their unwillingness to repent from their sins. And now he's reminded them of why they should listen. Because something is drawing nearer that is more permanent, not a fickle event that can be recreated, but a time where God is sending an ambassador for a permanent change. As his righteousness comes, he provides salvation. As I look at these big rocks on these beaches here in Cuba, I look at the coral that's embedded into them, and it's really incredible. But I wonder, what would it have taken to form that? What would it have taken to embed those coral pieces into this huge rock? I'm in awe of how amazing it is. As I look at the coastline, the beautiful blue waters, I'm reminded that the God I believe in is the one who spoke these things into existence. He created the ocean and brought order with it. He's the one who brought forth life, And he's the one that made it so detailed that I would stare at a rock along the coastline and be in awe. That's the God who speaks these words. He made the cliffs so magnificent that we would wonder how they were formed and cause us to search all these things out. But in that time of awe and wonder, you think about the creator of it all. And I think, personally, I don't think atheism has nothing to do with someone being convinced that there's no God. But it far more has to do with the rejections of the implications of a creator. The concept of God itself is not scary, but when you begin to think about the need of why we need to deliver our sin, our body that breaks down, ultimately our death, these are the implications that we have to deal with. And God calls the righteous to look upon the rock. But this rock's a little different than the huge ones along the beach that I've talked about before. This rock is different. It isn't forged by the tossing ocean, coral pieces being washed into it, and years of erosion. This rock is the maker of heaven and earth itself. And that's why Isaiah's words tell us to lift our eyes to the heavens, because someday a rock, the earth, and all the things we know will be changed or gone. I'm sure that Lighthouse Hotel looks a lot different than when Steph and I visited it in 2009. I bet those rocks look a lot different along the coast that I see at the beach. They look different than they did 100 years ago. But the only promise we have is in the rock. In its full reliance, trust, and faith in God to deliver us from all the things that erode and destroy what we see today. Because the promise of salvation is forever, and God's righteousness will always endure and return fruit. But this is the truth. The nation is at a crossroads. We're facing crisis. And the crisis is that we failed to fix our eyes on God, the author of salvation. Whether it be talking about racism, or where we talk about climate change, or where we talk about these hurricanes, or whether we talk about, it doesn't matter whether we talk about politics or abortion. It doesn't matter. The truth is that you and me, every single one of us, need to fix our eyes on God first. Long before you have your own political persuasions, implications, and things like that, we need to care about what God desires and says first. Isaiah reminds a broken nation in the midst of chaos, in the midst of being exiled, in the midst of worry and fear about so many different things. He says he look to the rock. From which you were given shape. Look to the pit from which you were delivered out of. And I think honestly, if we were being really honest with ourselves in this church this morning, I think we're far more likely to go get our news and our opinions given to us long before we're willing to pray about them, long before we're willing to search out the scriptures, long before we care about those things. And the result's the same. There's a reason they went into captivity. There's a reason their nation was broken and it could not be fixed except by exile or wrath. Our nation's no different, but it's not just Republicans and Democrats. It's not just about political issues. It's about heart issues, and it's about you and me. We need not to worry about the world first. We need to worry about ourselves first. We need to be looking upon God. We need to be looking upon the rock. We need to be looking upon the agents of change in the spiritual domain that are positive, that are righteous, that are things that transform us daily. And that's looking upon Christ. That's why Isaiah tells the broken people, these are people that already have believed. These are the people that are nation of Israel. These are the people that God chose for them. He's not talking to just the random heathens. He's talking to the believers and he's saying, you better get it together. You better look this way. Because if you don't, you're going to continue to miss it. That's my challenge, church. We gotta keep our eyes on the prize here. So what is the rock? As Jesus talks with his disciples about the false teachings of the religious leaders, he transitions by asking them a question. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? John the Baptist? Elijah? Another prophet? Then Jesus asks the question that he asks us today. But who do you say I am? In the midst of waves embedding coral into rocks, in the midst of chaos being set forth in society, in the midst of wondering whether we're going to make it as a nation, Jesus asks you, he asks me, who do you say that I am? Because we need to have commitment. We need to be firm into what we believe. I think far too often people think that Jesus was content as long as people were nice to each other. No, this is the same Jesus that flipped tables in the temple. The same Jesus that told the religious leaders that they were washed tombs. They looked nice on the outside, but were full of death and bones on the inside. This is the same Jesus that told the religious leaders that they were born from the lineage of Satan himself. Jesus really isn't into the lukewarm, hey, meh, whatever about him and the rock. Because the answer to the question for you and I and for the disciples is precisely what he promises to do with it. So before just having the Sunday school answer ready of who Jesus is, the confession that Jesus is Messiah, not a Messiah, but the Messiah, I had to sit and I had to wonder for myself, what would I say? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus in the most real sense in my own personal life, in Zach Bruningson's life? Who is he? He's my standard. He's the reasoning on how I try to live my life. He's the source of my love. He's the source of my willingness to be reconciled with people. He's the reason I love my children and my wife so much. Because he showed me to be great in his kingdom, I must decrease and he must increase. And as I honestly thought through who Jesus was to me, I wondered if this is one of the questions we've tried to avoid. But we can't answer because we can't answer it. We can't avoid it, We can't just, no, it's really not that big a deal. We need to define who Jesus is, and not just in our minds. We can't just acknowledge facts or truths or whatever it is, a religious system. That's not how it works. It has to be in the core of who we are, deepest part of our souls. That's what defines our soul, what we believe about Jesus. And Peter's answer is famous. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at the same guy who almost drowned a few chapters earlier, and he says, "Blessed are you." But then he goes on to say, pretty much because you didn't figure that out on your own, but God's revealed it to you. God unveiled it is literally what it means. Now you know who the real Rock of Ages is. And Jesus further says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, unfortunately, this verse has been one of those verses that's been taken to mean that Jesus or Peter was the first pope, and that's what he was saying. And that was the rock that Jesus was building his church on. But the original language, Peter, his name means rock, Petros, and rock are the same. Yet Jesus correctly makes an interesting play on words. You are the rock, you are a rock, but the rock I will build my church on is the confession of who Jesus is. The church of Jesus Christ is built on the revelation that comes from God that Jesus truly, indeed, once and for all is Messiah, the Son of the living God. That confession, that truth, is what Jesus builds his church on. And if we haven't confessed it, if it's not part of our lives, that it's not the whole meaning, the time is now, the church must be a nation of people
who believe firmly on that truth that Jesus is the Son of the living God. The rock foundation that builds the church, the people that are set apart, is the real confession that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. And once that truth is revealed, internalized, confessed, and held on to, not even the gates of hell can stop it. In Isaiah's reading, God warns the people that eventually the sky, the earth, and the bodies are going to go away. We will die. And that's why salvation is so important. But now Jesus says, upon the faith and confession that he is the Son of the living God, not even the pit itself that is a prison can hold those or overcome those who know Christ. But let's look at the redemptive value of these passages. Isaiah is writing a promise of restoration for a broken people. That God will change the circumstances if they live righteously and put their eyes upon him. There came a point in time, and those who were the people who put him out, shut him out of their lives. And he freely offers them back as an invitation to salvation. If you look at the redemptive value of this gospel reading, it is Peter who answers Jesus, and he says, "Blessed are you." Jesus isn't fickle with the "blessed are you." He was speaking that very redemptively after his almost sinking and having just a little bit of faith. But there's one last redemptive part about this. It was never about whether we were good enough, whether we washed our hands before we ate. It was much more than that if you read back the passages before. It's about this, that God freely offered Jesus, the Son of the living God, to offer eternal redemption for all who cannot even fathom how a large rock could be placed and shaped in such a way. God freely offers us salvation today upon faith, but you can't ignore the importance of that. But before that happens, you must settle in your own soul. Every single one of us this morning has to settle in our own soul what the rock really is. You must open your soul up to God speaking into it, just like he did with Peter, he did with me, and hopefully he's done with you. But upon this rock, the confession of Christ, the tides of the ocean won't wash it away. No hurricane forces will destroy it. Not even the deepest pit will overcome it. And as I close the sermon, may I remind you that this whole Christianity thing and this salvation thing is really not about us at all. It's about God's will. And God's will, if he spared his people, the people, through sacrificing his own son, I think he means serious business. And I think he means serious business for us to go out and reach people in the midst of their storms. In the midst of our ability to go out and as people ponder upon the earth, they're being told countless times that it's random chaos and their lives don't matter. And you and me have to be the people in the midst that not only tell them something differently, tell them something radically, that they were created in the image of God for a grand purpose, but we also need to live in their midst and pursue righteousness. We cannot be a bunch of stiffs who believe and acknowledge some truth in a book that's 2,000 years old. It's far more than that. We have to be compelled through the Spirit to go out and reach people, love people, sit in the midst of the storm with them. Because the reality is, Jesus very confidently said that this is the rock in which he'll build his church on, and not even the gates of hell will prevail over it. The church. Every believer that Jesus is the Son of the living God, who follows and pursues righteousness, will not be overcome. In the midst of the storm, in the midst of critics, in the midst of chaos, the tides will not wash it away, because he's offered something far more important than just something that delivers us today. It's eternity. In church, you may be given the promise that not even the gates of hell will overcome you, but you're also told that you're the light of the world, a city on a hill. and you're not to cover up the light with a basket. Love people, love Christ, fix your eyes upon the rock. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to worship today in Trumbull. And God, we thank you for safety. God, we thank you for so many different things. We thank you for your creation, that we could ponder upon the beautiful things that you do. But God, may you give us hope in our lives. May you remind us that Jesus is the Son of the living God. Remind us that that is the rock foundation in which you will build the foundation of your church, the followers, the people that are set forth and set out. God, may you give us hope. May you give us strength to reach those who don't have hope, who just wonder why they're here. But God, also may you lift up our friends and our family and the people in the lines of devastation in Texas and in Florida and the islands that we've seen. God, we thank you for the safety that we have. We've been given far more than we deserve. And in sitting in the comfort of our own homes and in the comfort of our own church, God, we're really blessed. May we fix our eyes upon you in everything that we do. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.